Okay, good afternoon. We're going to call the Ordinance Committee meeting to order. I'd like to start first with a roll call.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Here.
Mayor Murillo.
Here.
Chair Snedden.
Here. Thank you. This would be the time when we receive public comment, but seeing none, thank you. We will proceed to the agenda item discussing floodplain management ordinance revisions to comply with federal freeboard standards and clarify the applicability date. Thank you. And inviting staff presentation at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and committee members, my name is Andrew Stuffler. I'm the building official for the city. I'm also the floodplain manager. So when FEMA comes to us, or the Department of Water Resources at the state level comes to us and says you need to update your floodplain management ordinance, I have the pleasure of doing that. And we went through this last year, as some of you might remember. We had given a copy of that ordinance to the State Department of Water Resources and FEMA to review before we brought it to council. And they said it looked good. So we went through all the process and had the discussion about residential freeboard and should we require that or not, thinking it was optional. Once we gave FEMA and Department of Water Resources a copy of our ordinance that was approved, they said that it did not meet the minimum standards and that the freeboard was required for all building types. So a little frustrating. We're back in front of Ordinance Committee. We'll be back in front of council soon with the amended ordinance so that it meets what FEMA's minimum standards are. The takeaway from this, from a practical standpoint, is what we approved last year enabled existing structures, existing homes, 1 and 2 family dwellings, to do work on their structure, have a substantial work on their structure, essentially making it more new than old, and still not have to elevate the building up above the base flood elevation, any higher than the base flood elevation. They just had to get it right above where the water is anticipated to be. The state has a policy that, and FEMA supports it, that it has to be, those buildings have to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So that's what's in the ordinance before you now. We've stricken all the text in here that dealt with the exempting those 1 and 2 family dwellings. And we're back to now all buildings, whether they're commercial or residential, if they are more new than old, then they have to have I see one of the committee members is looking for the ordinance. Is the ordinance in your packet?
Just the change is in our packet and then the FEMA fact sheet.
I'm going to turn to the city attorney representative to give us some advice here.
The council, the Ordinance Committee report did say that copies are available in the clerk's office. So maybe what we do is we take a short recess and get copies from the clerk's office.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, we will recess at 12:35 and be back when we have clerk's office ordinance. Okay, thank you. We're ready to reconvene the Ordinance Committee meeting and continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as I was saying, we were directed by FEMA and the Department of Water Resources to amend our ordinance and require this freeboard, this extra elevation above the base flood elevation for all buildings that are new or substantially improved, which is, in very gross terms, more new than old if they're remodeled. And if you will look at the ordinance that we passed out on page 28, pages 28, 29, and 33, that's the strikeout that you'll see where we required the substantial improvement of any structure to be elevated, and we struck all the text that had to do with exempting 1- and 2-family dwelling buildings. And that's the end of my report.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you.
I knew that.
Do we have any questions from the committee? Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Stuffler, on, you said all buildings. You're talking about commercial buildings as well?
Yes, sir.
So, and when you say, we'll go back to the argument I had before about substantial. Substantial, as I understood it in our last meeting, was anything about the depreciated value of the structure itself, not the land value counting, as being, and it was a percentage of over 50% of the depreciated value of the existing structure. Correct?
That's generally correct, yes.
So I'm thinking, like, if I own the building where the Enterprise Fish Company is, an old masonry building, and it has a great value as a property and a building together, let's say it's $4 or $5 million in value, but the depreciated structure itself is an old masonry laundromat. And I don't know what that would be worth. I have no idea of the same. But let's say, for example, I had to, by law, I had to redo the roof and redo the structure and all the things, probably $1 million worth of work to do on a building of that size. And now I'm up over the depreciated value of a masonry building in the floodplain. Would this mean that I'd have to raise that entire building by that amount of freeboard?
No. And the reason I say no is because non-residential buildings can flood-proof. They can use gates and they can protect the openings of the building so that you don't have to elevate it. You essentially mitigate the flood hazard by putting up flood gates or flood walls around the building up to a foot above the base flood elevation. We did this at the Californian Hotel. You can't really tell because on the outside of the building, all there are the cleats that they clip the brackets into, and then they slide the panels in when there's a flooding event. So that's called dry flood proofing, and it's only allowed in non-residential buildings. So that's what they would have to do in a scenario where they tripped the substantial improvement clause and had to protect their building to a foot above the base flood elevation.
And what about the commercial use of a formerly residential building? And the example I would use is some of the bed and breakfast operations that are in town. There's one actually right down by City College I'm thinking of in general. It's in the flood zone. And so it's an old Victorian, and so I would assume that if they had substantial work to that building, they probably wouldn't be able to do what you're talking about in a building like that. They'd probably have to raise the building by the floodplain amount.
Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse, I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
That's a level of kind of finite detail in the residential definition of residential structure that I can't answer off the top of my head.
Okay. And then before I go further with this line of reasoning and whatnot, we don't have any discretion here, do we?
That's correct. We don't.
Yeah, Madam Chair, that was what I was just about to add. Is that unlike our discussion that we had last October, the reason we're coming back is that we were told that we don't have this discretion. That even if the city didn't adopt its local ordinance, the building code and the residential code taken together would capture all of these projects and require the freeboard addition in addition to raising it up for the substantial improvements.
And the substantial improvement, once again, is over 50% of the depreciated value of the building. Who assesses the building for a value when it comes to that?
Madam Chair, committee members, that's That's a good question. So FEMA gives guidelines on how to do that. There is no codified regulation that tells you specifically how to do it. We try to exercise good professional common sense and judgment. If we can't come to agreement on what needs to be submitted, we'll require that a professional appraiser, appraise the property and the improvements and give us that really kind of high level detail. But that's pretty expensive, and we try to avoid that.
No, I see that, and once again, my fear is that somebody with amounts of, a number of, or any number of residential properties are put out as rentals, and they try to upgrade them by doing new kitchens or things you really like. I'll see a landlord do, and they go, well, I'm not going to do that if it's going to kick me into raising the entire building up. And then the last question would be, did we talk about historic zones last time, things like the Brinkerhof that's on a creek bed, or places like that where there's a or like the lower West Beach area and whatnot, where there are historical structures. Are those also subject to the FEMA law, or do they have, because there's in the Brinkerhof, for example, there's height restrictions. So do historical districts have any play in this?
Madam Chair, committee members, yeah, historical structures do get the benefit of the state historical building code exemptions, which can include floodplain management ordinance exemptions.
All right,
If it destroys the historical integrity of the site or structure, then they have some relief.
Mayor Muriel? Oh, no questions. Thank you. Then I have a quick question. In the FEMA fact sheet, they're using the definition of feet above the 1% annual chance flood level, and in our ordinance, are we using 100-year flood and those I understand are equivalent? And my question is, if it changes based on recent events or what the 100-year flood is, does the ordinance flex then to apply to those new zones? If FEMA changes where that baseline is, then new structures then have to comply with the new floodplain? Am I understanding that correctly?
Madam Chair, yes. So FEMA establishes, they have a program for updating their maps, their flood maps. We participate in that program. We're a participating community. There's a whole process for that. You're going to see that go through probably this summer when we update our coastal maps, because FEMA did an update of all of California's coast, the whole West Coast actually. So there's a appeal period. We have to do public outreach. Then there's another appeal period, and then they publish the map. And I think it has to be published for 180 days or 6 months before it goes into effect. And then they do insurance notifications so that anybody who might be brought into the floodplain, or not the floodplain, the 100-year or 1% chance of flooding zones, have an opportunity to buy their insurance before the map goes into effect. It gives them a break on the cost of the insurance. So there's a whole procedure that goes with map updates, and this ordinance is set up so that we don't have to come back to council every time the map updates.
Thank you. That's my question. Do we have any further questions? No? We're ready to take a vote or have a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't see any public comment, so with all due respect to the former Ordinance Committee, we did our best in acknowledging FEMA's requirements. I move that our Ordinance Committee recommend to the City Council we adopt this revised ordinance related to our floodplain management practices.
I will go right for a second.
Okay. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. With that, the ordinance passes, and will then go on to City Council? Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
So the Ordinance Committee meeting will adjourn. Thank you.